The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Clarence's house as Prince Harry adjusted his collar for the third time in 10 minutes. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold seeping through the Georgian walls, but from the weight of what lay ahead. The phone call from his father had come 3 days earlier, brief and formal, requesting a private meeting to discuss matters of mutual concern. No mention of Meghan. No mention of the children. Just the two of them, as it had been in those painful months after Diana's death when the world felt like it was crumbling around them. Harry's driver, a silent man named Thompson who had served the family for decades, pulled the black Range Rover through the gates of Clarence's house precisely at 7 in the evening. The November darkness had already settled over London, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the courtyard. Harry had chosen to arrive after sunset, hoping to avoid the ever-present photographers who seemed to multiply like weeds around any royal residence. The last thing he needed was speculation about this meeting spreading across the front pages before he even understood what his father wanted to discuss. As he walked through the familiar corridors lined with portraits of long-dead relatives, Harry's mind wandered to the conversation he'd had with Meghan just hours earlier. She had been feeding Lilibet in their Montecito kitchen, the California sunshine streaming through the windows in sharp contrast to the grey London weather he now found himself in. "Just remember what we talked about," she had said, her voice carrying that edge it took on when she was trying to appear calm but was actually anything but. "We're building our own life now. We don't need their approval for anything." But Harry knew it wasn't that simple. Despite everything that had happened, despite the interviews and the book and the documentary, Charles was still his father. The man who had taught him to ride horses at Balmoral, who had comforted him through his darkest moments after losing his mother, who had walked him down the aisle when he married Meghan. The complicated web of love and resentment, duty and rebellion that defined their relationship couldn't be untangled by an ocean and good intentions. A footman Harry didn't recognize led him through the blue drawing room and down a corridor he remembered from childhood visits. The palace felt different somehow, more formal and less welcoming than it had during his grandmother's reign. Elizabeth had possessed a warmth that could melt the coldest protocol, but Charles had always been more distant, more aware of the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders. Even as a child, Harry had sensed that his father saw him as both a beloved son and a potential problem to be managed. The footman knocked gently on a heavy oak door and waited for the familiar voice to call out, "Come in." Harry's stomach tightened as he stepped into his father's private study, a room he hadn't entered in over 3 years. The space was exactly as he remembered it, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves packed with leather-bound volumes, a massive mahogany desk that had belonged to George VI, and the lingering scent of his father's preferred tea blend mixed with the wood polish the housekeeping staff used on the antique furniture. Charles stood with his back to the door, gazing out the window at the darkened garden beyond. He wore a navy wool suit that Harry recognized as one of his father's favorites, slightly rumpled in the way that suggested he'd been wearing it since early morning. His silver hair, thinner now than Harry remembered, caught the light from the desk lamp. For a moment, neither man spoke, and Harry was transported back to those awkward father-son moments of his youth when he'd been summoned to account for some misbehavior or discuss his uncertain future. "Thank you for coming," Charles said finally, turning to face his younger son. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, and there was a weariness in his expression that Harry hadn't noticed during their brief public encounters over the past few years. "Please, sit down. We have much to discuss." Harry settled into the leather armchair across from his father's desk, the same chair where he'd sat as a teenager to discuss his struggles at school, his brief rebellious phase, and, eventually his decision to join the military. The furniture hadn't changed, but everything else felt different. The easy familiarity was gone, replaced by the careful politeness of strangers trying to navigate dangerous territory. Charles poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter on the side table, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. He handed one to Harry before settling behind his desk, creating a physical barrier between them that felt both natural and symbolic. "I've been thinking a great deal about our family lately," he began, his voice carrying the measured tone he used during official speeches. "About the mistakes we've made, the opportunities we've missed, and the possibility of finding a path forward." Harry sipped his whiskey, savoring the familiar burn as it went down his throat. It was the same single malt his father had always preferred, a Highland Scotch that tasted of smoke and honey and tradition. "What kind of path forward?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the hope that was beginning to stir in his chest. Despite everything that had happened, despite the anger and hurt and public recriminations, a part of him still longed for reconciliation with the family he'd grown up believing he would serve for life. His father opened a leather portfolio on his desk and withdrew a single sheet of paper. Even from across the desk, Harry could see it was covered with Charles's distinctive handwriting, the careful script he'd learned as a child and never abandoned despite the modern world's embrace of digital communication. "I've drafted what I'm calling the Highgrove Accord," Charles said, using the name of his beloved country estate in Gloucestershire. "A private agreement between us that could provide a framework for healing the divisions in our family." Harry leaned forward, his curiosity overriding his caution. "What kind of agreement?" Charles cleared his throat, a gesture Harry remembered from childhood that usually preceded important pronouncements. "The foundation of this accord is simple," he began. "You would return to the United Kingdom for 6 months of every year, resuming limited royal duties in a capacity we would mutually determine. In exchange, the family would provide financial support for your security costs and establish a trust fund for Archie and Lilibet that would ensure their future regardless of their relationship with the monarchy." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a snuffed candle. Harry felt his heart rate increase as he processed the implications. 6 months in the UK would mean 6 months away from the life he and Meghan had built in California. It would mean bringing the children back into the royal bubble they'd worked so hard to escape. But it would also mean financial security, professional purpose, and, most importantly, a chance to rebuild the relationship with his family that he missed more than he cared to admit. There would be conditions, of course, Charles continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. "No unauthorized interviews or books. No public criticism of family members or royal protocols. And any commercial ventures would need prior approval from the palace communications team." He paused, meeting Harry's eyes directly. "The accord would be private, known only to us and, perhaps William, depending on how discussions progress." Harry's mind raced as he considered the proposal. The financial benefits were substantial, but money had never been his primary concern. What drew him was the possibility of serving his country again, of having a clear sense of purpose beyond the celebrity appearances and speaking engagements that filled his California schedule. More than that, it offered a chance to give his children what he'd lost too young, a relationship with their grandfather and the extended family that came with royal blood. But, even as hope bloomed in his chest, Harry couldn't shake the image of Meghan's face when she'd warned him about this very meeting. She'd suspected his father would make some kind of offer, some attempt to lure him back into the fold. "They'll promise you the world," she'd said, "but it will come with strings attached. It always does with them." "What about Meghan?" Harry asked, the question that had been burning in his throat since his father began outlining the proposal. "Where does she fit into this accord?" Charles's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle change that Harry might have missed if he hadn't spent 38 years learning to read his father's moods. "Meghan would be welcome at family events, naturally," he said carefully. "But her role would be limited. The accord recognizes that she has built her own career and interests in America. We wouldn't expect her to abandon those commitments." The careful phrasing sent a chill down Harry's spine. He understood royal speak well enough to recognize what his father wasn't saying. Meghan would be tolerated, perhaps even welcomed at Christmas dinners and state occasions, but she wouldn't be truly accepted back into the fold. The accord was designed to separate him from his wife without explicitly saying so, to offer him a path back to royal life that would be difficult for her to share. Harry set down his whiskey glass with more force than necessary, the crystal ringing against the wood of the side table. "You want me to choose," he said, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. "Between my family and my wife." Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression pained but resolute. "I want you to consider what's best for everyone involved," he said quietly. "Your children deserve to know their heritage, their history, their place in the world. You deserve to serve your country in a meaningful way. And, perhaps some distance from the pressures and influences that have driven so much conflict would allow wounds to heal." The room fell silent except for the steady drumming of rain against the windows. Harry stared at the document on his father's desk, trying to imagine explaining this moment to Meghan. She had trusted him to come to this meeting, had trusted that his loyalty to their marriage and their shared vision of their future would remain unshakable. How could he tell her that for a moment, perhaps longer than a moment, he had seriously considered his father's proposal? "I need time to think about this," Harry said finally, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of the decision before him. Charles nodded, as if he'd expected this response. "Of course. But, Harry." He paused, and, when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of years of estrangement and regret. "Opportunities like this don't come often. The institution moves slowly, and there are others who would prefer that this particular door remain closed forever. If you're going to consider this path, don't wait too long to decide. Harry stood to leave, his legs unsteady beneath him. As he reached the door, his father called out one final time. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I love you. I've never stopped loving you, despite everything that's happened between us. The words hit Harry like a physical blow, carrying with them all the conversations they'd never had, all the support he'd craved during his darkest moments, all the pride and disappointment and hope that had defined their relationship since Diana's death. He turned back to look at his father, seeing not the King of England but the man who had tried, in his imperfect way, to raise two sons while carrying the weight of an ancient institution on his shoulders. I love you too, Dad, Harry said quietly, the childhood name slipping out before he could stop it. I'll be in touch. As he walked back through the corridors of Clarence House, Harry's mind was already racing ahead to the conversation he would have to have with Meghan. How could he explain that his father's offer was both exactly what she'd feared and exactly what a part of him had always wanted? How could he make her understand that the choice before him wasn't simply between his birth family and his chosen family, but between two completely different visions of what their life together could become? The ride back to his hotel passed in a blur of London streetlights and racing thoughts. By the time Thompson pulled up to the entrance of the discreet boutique hotel where Harry was staying, he had made a decision that would change everything. He would seriously consider his father's proposal. More than that, he would meet with Charles again to discuss the details and negotiate terms that might make the accord work for everyone involved. What Harry didn't know, as he walked through the hotel lobby and took the elevator to his suite, was that across the Atlantic Ocean, Meghan was having trouble sleeping. Something in his voice during their last phone call had set off alarm bells in her mind, a subtle shift in tone that suggested the meeting with his father might not go exactly as they'd planned. She had learned to trust her instincts about the royal family, and, right now, those instincts were screaming that trouble was coming their way. As Harry finally fell asleep in his London hotel room, the Highgrove Accord sat on his father's desk, waiting for a signature that would either heal a fractured family or tear it apart completely. The next 48 hours would determine which outcome would prevail, but already the wheels were in motion for a confrontation that would make their previous conflicts seem like gentle disagreements between reasonable people. The storm gathering over the royal family was about to break, and Harry was standing directly in its path, unaware that his next decision would force him to choose not just between two countries, but between two versions of himself that could never coexist. 3 days after the meeting at Clarence House, Harry found himself walking through Hyde Park at dawn, his security detail maintaining a discreet distance as he tried to make sense of the decision that was tearing him apart. London in November was harsh and unforgiving, the bare trees reaching toward a grey sky that seemed to mirror his internal turmoil. He had extended his stay in the UK twice now, each delay requiring increasingly creative explanations to Meghan about meetings that were running longer than expected and details that needed to be sorted out. The truth was that he had met with his father 2 more times since that first evening, each conversation adding layers of complexity to what had initially seemed like a straightforward proposal. Charles had been patient, understanding, and surprisingly flexible in his willingness to modify the terms of the accord. The 6-month residency requirement had been reduced to 4 months, with the possibility of splitting the time between London and Scotland to minimize media attention. The restrictions on commercial ventures had been loosened to allow for Harry's existing commitments while requiring approval only for new projects that might reflect poorly on the monarchy. Most significantly, Charles had agreed to establish a substantial education fund for Archie and Lilibet that would be accessible regardless of whether Harry ultimately accepted the accord. It was a gesture of good faith that spoke to his father's genuine desire to repair their relationship and ensure his grandchildren's future. The offer now included benefits that extended far beyond what Harry had dared to hope for when he first walked into that study 3 nights ago. But, with each improvement to the terms, Harry felt the weight of what he would be asking Meghan to sacrifice growing heavier. The accord would require her to spend significant portions of each year in a country where she had never felt truly welcome, surrounded by people who had made their disapproval of her clear through years of calculated slights and media manipulation. More than that, it would mean returning to a life where every outfit choice, every public appearance, and every casual comment would be scrutinized and criticized by a press corps that had never forgiven her for disrupting their narrative about the royal family. Harry's phone buzzed with yet another text from Meghan asking when he would be coming home. The messages had been growing shorter and more pointed over the past 2 days, a clear sign that her patience was wearing thin. She had trusted him to handle this meeting with his father and returned to California with a clear mind and renewed commitment to their independent life. Instead, he was walking through a London park at 6 in the morning, trying to find the courage to call her and explain that everything they had planned might be about to change. He settled on a bench overlooking the Serpentine, watching early morning joggers follow their predictable routes around the water. In a few hours, this park would be filled with tourists and families, but for now it belonged to the dedicated few who found peace in the quiet hours before the city fully awakened. Harry envied their simple purpose, the clarity of knowing exactly where they were going and why. His phone rang, and Meghan's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, he considered letting it go to voicemail, but he knew that would only make the eventual conversation more difficult. "Good morning, love," he said, trying to inject warmth into his voice despite the anxiety that was making his chest tight. "It's nearly midnight here," Meghan replied, and he could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "I couldn't sleep. Archie's been asking when Daddy's coming home, and I keep having to tell him I don't know." "When are you coming home, Harry?" The direct question cut through all his careful preparations for this conversation. He had planned to ease into the topic of his father's proposal, to explain the complexities and the potential benefits before revealing the full scope of what Charles was offering. But Meghan's tired voice and the mention of their son asking for him stripped away all his diplomatic intentions. "Something's come up," he said carefully. "My father has made a proposal that I think we need to discuss. It could change everything for our family." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Harry began to wonder if the call had dropped. When Meghan finally spoke, her voice was cold and controlled in a way that immediately put him on high alert. "What kind of proposal?" Harry took a deep breath and began to explain the accord, starting with the financial benefits and the educational opportunities for their children before moving on to the residency requirements and the limitations that would be placed on their public activities. He tried to present it as neutrally as possible, but even as he spoke, he could feel the enthusiasm creeping into his voice when he talked about returning to meaningful royal duties and rebuilding his relationship with William and his father. Meghan listened without interrupting, but Harry could practically feel her anger building with each detail he revealed. When he finished explaining the proposal, the silence returned, heavier this time and charged with an electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Meghan said finally, her voice so calm it was terrifying. "Your father wants you to abandon the life we've built together, move back to a country where I was systematically destroyed by the media and marginalized by his family, and resume a role that nearly killed us both mentally and emotionally. In exchange, he's offering money we don't need and the privilege of serving an institution that has never valued either of us as anything more than useful props." It's more complicated than that," Harry said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew how weak they sounded. The children would benefit enormously from having a relationship with their grandfather and their heritage. And I could actually make a difference again, instead of just giving speeches to people who are already convinced of what I'm trying to say. "The children have a grandfather," Meghan shot back. "They have my father, who loves them unconditionally and doesn't require them to live on a different continent 4 months out of every year to earn that love. And you are already making a difference, Harry. The veterans you work with, the mental health initiatives, the environmental projects, all of that matters. Just because it doesn't come with a fancy title doesn't make it less valuable." Harry closed his eyes, feeling the truth in her words even as he struggled against them. "But what if this is our chance to heal the family? What if walking away from this opportunity means Archie and Lilibet never get to know their cousins, never understand their place in history?" "Their place in history?" Meghan's voice rose for the first time, and Harry could picture her pacing around their kitchen in Montecito, her hands gesturing as they always did when she was trying to control her anger. "Harry, listen to yourself. You sound exactly like them. You're talking about our children as if they're symbols instead of people, as if their value depends on their proximity to a crown instead of who they are as individuals." The accusation hit harder than Harry had expected because part of him recognized the truth in it. Growing up royal had meant learning to think of himself as both a person and a symbol, to weigh every decision against its impact on the institution as well as his own happiness. It was a mindset he had fought to overcome in California, but his father's proposal had awakened those old patterns of thinking. "I'm not saying we have to accept," Harry said, trying to find middle ground. "I'm saying we should consider it. The financial security alone would mean never having to worry about the children's futures." "We're not worried about their futures now," Meghan replied. "We're building something real, something that belongs to us. Why would we trade that for the chance to be junior players in someone else's game again?" Harry stood up from the bench and began walking aimlessly along the water's edge, his security team adjusting their positions to maintain their protective circle around him. "Because maybe it's not just someone else's game. Maybe it's my heritage, my birthright, my chance to serve something larger than myself. Your birthright? The words came out like a physical blow. Harry, your birthright nearly destroyed you. Your birthright killed your mother. Your birthright turned you into a person you didn't recognize and didn't like. And now you want to go back to that? The conversation was spiraling out of control, moving far beyond the specific terms of his father's proposal into fundamental questions about who Harry was and who he wanted to be. Part of him wanted to end the call, to give them both time to cool down before they said things that couldn't be taken back. But another part of him needed to push through this moment, to find out whether their marriage could survive the revelation that he was seriously considering a return to royal life. What I want is to stop feeling like I'm running away from everything, Harry said, surprised by his own honesty. What I want is to feel like I belong somewhere, like I'm part of something that matters. And maybe that means finding a way to bridge the life we've built with the family I came from. Meghan was quiet for so long that Harry began to worry she had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, softer but somehow more devastating than her anger had been. You don't belong with them, Harry. You proved that when you chose me, when you chose our children, when you chose to tell the truth about what that family really is. But if you need to learn that lesson again, if you need to go back and remember why we left, then maybe that's what has to happen. Meg, please, I can't do this again, Harry. I can't go back to being the problem that needs to be managed, the outsider who doesn't understand how things work, the American who's too emotional and too independent for her own good. I won't put our children through that either. Her voice was steady now, resolved in a way that terrified him. If you sign that accord, you're choosing them over us. And I need you to understand that if you make that choice, there won't be a way back. The line went dead, and Harry found himself staring at his phone in the gray morning light, wondering how a conversation that was supposed to be about bringing their families together had become an ultimatum that threatened to destroy everything he held dear. He tried calling back, but the call went straight to voicemail. He tried texting, but the messages showed as delivered but unread. For the first time since his father had made the proposal, Harry began to understand the true cost of what was being offered. It wasn't just about spending time in the UK or resuming royal duties. It was about choosing between two incompatible versions of himself, the prince who had been trained from birth to put duty before personal happiness, and the man who had found peace and purpose in California with the woman who had taught him that love didn't require sacrifice of one's essential self. Harry's private secretary, James, appeared at his elbow with the discretion that came from years of royal service. Sir, you have the meeting with His Majesty at 10 o'clock. Shall I confirm your attendance? The meeting was supposed to be the final discussion before Harry made his decision about the accord. His father was expecting an answer, and the legal team had prepared documents that would need to be signed if he chose to move forward. But how could he sign anything now, knowing that doing so would mean losing Meghan and possibly his children? Cancel it, Harry said, the words coming out before he had fully processed the decision. Tell my father that I need more time to consider the proposal. James looked concerned but nodded professionally. Of course, sir. Shall I reschedule for later in the week? Harry shook his head, feeling a clarity that had been missing since this entire situation began. No. I'm flying back to California today. Book the earliest available flight. As he walked back toward the park exit, Harry's phone buzzed with a text from William, heard about Dad's proposal. Think you should take it. Family needs to heal. The message was followed by another, Meg will understand eventually. This is bigger than any of us. The texts from his brother crystallized something that had been nagging at Harry since his first meeting with his father. This wasn't really about healing the family or providing opportunities for his children. This was about the institution's need to control the narrative, to bring him back into the fold where his story could be managed and his criticism neutralized. The accord was as much about silencing him as it was about welcoming him home. Harry deleted the messages without responding and climbed into the back of his car, giving Thompson instructions to take him to Heathrow. As London's familiar streets flashed past the windows, he tried to imagine how he would explain to Meghan that he was coming home, that he had chosen their life together over the seductive pull of his royal heritage. But even as he practiced the words in his head, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had been broken in their relationship during that phone call. Meghan had asked him to choose between his birth family and his chosen family, and he had chosen her. But the fact that he had needed time to make that choice, that he had seriously considered the alternative, might be a betrayal that no amount of explanation could heal. For the first time since leaving royal life, Harry began to understand that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. The plane lifted off from Heathrow 6 hours later, carrying Harry back toward a confrontation that would either save his marriage or end it. Below him, London disappeared into the clouds, along with the last vestiges of his life as a working member of the royal family. He had made his choice, but, as the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft, Harry couldn't escape the feeling that the real consequences of his father's proposal were only beginning to unfold. Somewhere over the Irish Sea, Harry's phone received a final message from Charles. "I understand your need for time, but please remember that some doors, once closed, are never opened again. I love you, son." The message would remain unread for hours, but its implications would reverberate through the royal family for months to come. The Highgrove Accord was dead, but the damage it had inflicted on Harry's marriage was only beginning to become clear. The silence in the Montecito house was deafening when Harry finally walked through the front door at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. He had expected to find Meghan waiting for him, perhaps angry or hurt, but ready to talk through what had happened during his extended stay in London. Instead, he found empty rooms that somehow felt more like a museum than a home, with everything perfectly in place but missing the warmth and energy that usually filled the space when his family was present. "Meghan," he called out, setting his luggage down in the foyer and listening for any sign of life in the house. "Kids?" The only response was the distant sound of gardeners working outside and the hum of the air conditioning system. Harry checked his phone, realizing he hadn't heard from Meghan since their disastrous conversation 3 days earlier. His messages had gone unread, his calls unreturned, and now it seemed she had taken the children and left without telling him where they were going. A handwritten note waited for him on the kitchen counter, Meghan's familiar script covering a single sheet of cream-colored paper. His hands shook slightly as he picked it up, knowing that whatever she had written would either begin the process of healing their marriage or confirm that it was over. "Harry," the note began, "I've taken the children to my mother's house. We need time to think about what happened while you were in London, and I need space to decide whether the man I married still exists. I know you chose to come home instead of signing your father's accord, but the fact that you needed to choose at all has changed something fundamental between us. When you're ready to have an honest conversation about who you really are and what you really want from this life we've built together, call me. Until then, please don't try to contact us. The children are safe and they know you love them, but they also deserve stability, and right now I can't give them that while I'm trying to figure out whether their father is someone I can trust with our future." Harry read the note 3 times before it fully sank in. Meghan wasn't just angry about his consideration of the accord, she was questioning their entire relationship, wondering whether the man she had fallen in love with was the same person who had spent a week in London entertaining the idea of returning to royal life. The realization hit him like a physical blow, making him sink into one of the kitchen chairs as the magnitude of what he had lost began to become clear. The house phone rang, startling him out of his stunned contemplation. For a moment he hoped it might be Meghan calling to talk, but the caller ID showed his father's private number. Harry stared at the phone as it rang, torn between his desire to ignore the call entirely and his curiosity about what Charles might have to say now that the accord had been effectively rejected. "Hello, Dad," he said finally, his voice hoarse from the combination of travel fatigue and emotional exhaustion. "Harry, thank God," Charles replied, and there was genuine relief in his voice. "I'd been worried since you left London so abruptly. James said you needed more time to consider the proposal, but I sensed there was more to it than that." Harry looked around his empty house, wondering how to explain that his father's offer had cost him everything that mattered most in his life. "The accord is off the table," he said simply. "I can't accept it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Charles spoke again, his tone had shifted to something more formal and distant. "I see. May I ask what changed your mind?" "Meghan," Harry said, the single word carrying the weight of everything he had lost. "She made it clear that accepting your proposal would mean choosing between my birth family and the family I'd built with her. I chose her, but apparently the fact that I hesitated was enough to damage our marriage, possibly beyond repair." Charles was quiet for so long that Harry began to wonder if the call had been dropped. When his father finally spoke, his words were careful and measured. "I'm sorry to hear that, Harry. That wasn't the outcome I intended when I made the proposal." "What outcome did you intend?" Harry asked, genuine curiosity cutting through his emotional exhaustion. "Did you really think Meghan would be happy about moving back to the UK for 4 months every year? Did you think she would just accept being marginalized again while I resumed royal duties?" "I thought she might see the benefits for your children," Charles replied. And perhaps I hoped that time and distance had softened some of the harder feelings about her experience as a working royal. Harry let out a bitter laugh. Time and distance haven't softened anything, Dad. If anything, being away from that life has made Meghan more certain that she never wants to go back to it. And, honestly, most days I feel the same way. But, not every day? Charles asked, seizing on the qualification in Harry's statement. The question forced Harry to confront a truth he had been avoiding since his first meeting at Clarence House. No, he admitted quietly. Not every day. Some days I miss the sense of purpose, the feeling that I was serving something larger than myself. Some days I wonder if I gave up too easily, if there might have been a way to make it work if I had tried harder. Those feelings don't make you a bad husband or father, Charles said gently. They make you human. And they make you my son. The words were meant to be comforting, but they only made Harry feel worse. If Meghan could hear this conversation, if she knew that part of him genuinely missed royal life, it would confirm all her worst fears about his commitment to their independent existence. She had built her life around the assumption that he was completely done with the monarchy, and, discovering that his feelings were more complicated than that had shattered her sense of security in their relationship. I need to go, Harry said abruptly. I need to figure out how to fix this mess with my wife and children. Harry, wait, Charles said urgently. If you change your mind about the accord, if circumstances shift, the offer remains open. Not forever, but for a reasonable period of time. The offer hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore even though Harry knew he should reject it immediately. I won't change my mind, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Perhaps not, Charles agreed. But life has a way of surprising us, and I would hate for pride to prevent us from healing our family when the opportunity presents itself. After ending the call, Harry sat in his empty kitchen as the afternoon faded into evening, thinking about the impossible choice that had destroyed his peace of mind and, possibly, his marriage. He could see the appeal of his father's proposal more clearly now that he was alone with his thoughts. The accord would have provided structure, purpose, and a clear sense of identity that had been missing from his California life. More than that, it would have represented a reconciliation with his heritage that part of him craved despite all the pain that heritage had caused. But Meghan was right that accepting the accord would have meant returning to a life that had nearly destroyed them both. The royal family had never truly accepted her, and the British media had treated her with a hostility that bordered on racism. Going back would mean subjecting their children to the same scrutiny and pressure that had marked Harry's own childhood, the same loss of privacy and freedom that had shaped every aspect of his development. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted his brooding, and, for a moment, Harry's heart leaped with the hope that Meghan had returned. But, when he looked out the window, he saw his friend Marcus stepping out of a Tesla, carrying what appeared to be takeout containers from their favorite Thai restaurant. Thought you might need some company, Marcus said when Harry opened the front door. Meghan called me from her mom's place and said you were flying back today. Figured you'd probably be sitting in this empty house overthinking everything. Harry accepted the food gratefully, realizing he hadn't eaten since the airplane meal on his flight from London. As they sat at the kitchen table sharing pad thai and green curry, Marcus waited patiently for Harry to explain what had happened. The story came out in fragments, interrupted by long periods of silence as Harry struggled to put his complicated feelings into words. So let me get this straight, Marcus said when Harry had finished explaining about the accord and Meghan's reaction. Your dad offered you a part-time return to royal duties in exchange for financial support and a relationship with your family. You seriously considered it, which freaked Meghan out enough that she took the kids and left. And now you're sitting here wondering if you made the right choice by coming home instead of signing the deal. When you put it like that, it sounds like I'm an idiot, Harry said, pushing rice around on his plate without actually eating it. You're not an idiot, Marcus replied. You're a guy who got offered something he thought he'd never want, and it turned out to be more tempting than expected. That doesn't make you a bad person, but it does mean you need to figure out what you actually want from your life. I want my wife and children back, Harry said immediately. Okay, but what else? Because if that's all you want, if you're completely satisfied with the life you've built here, then why was your dad's offer so tempting? Why did you need time to think about it instead of saying no immediately? The question forced Harry to confront feelings he had been suppressing since leaving royal life. I miss having a clear sense of purpose, he admitted. I miss feeling like my work matters in a way that creates real change instead of just raising awareness. And I miss being part of something bigger than myself, even if that something was flawed and sometimes harmful. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Those are legitimate feelings, man. But you can't build a life with Meghan based on suppressing half of who you are. If part of you misses royal life, you need to find a way to honor that without destroying your marriage. How? Harry asked, genuinely at a loss. Meghan has made it clear that any involvement with the royal family is a deal-breaker for her. She sees it as going backward, returning to a life that hurt us both. Maybe the problem is thinking about it in terms of going backward instead of going forward, Marcus suggested. What if there was a way to reconnect with your family and your heritage that didn't require returning to royal duties? What if you could find a middle ground that acknowledges your complicated feelings without sacrificing your independence? Harry considered this, trying to imagine what such a middle ground might look like. My father's offer was all or nothing. Either I come back as a working royal or I remain estranged from the family. But that was his offer, not the only possible arrangement, Marcus pointed out. What if you made a counter-proposal? What if you found a way to be part of your children's relationship with their grandfather without becoming a working royal yourself? The idea was intriguing, but Harry couldn't see how it would address Meghan's fundamental objections to any royal involvement. She didn't just object to the duties and protocols, she objected to the power dynamic that made Harry feel like he needed his family's approval in the first place. From her perspective, any ongoing relationship with the royals would be a sign that Harry hadn't truly committed to their independent life. I think I need to talk to Meghan, Harry said finally. I need to be completely honest about my feelings, even if it's not what she wants to hear. And I need to listen to her fears without dismissing them or trying to fix them. Marcus smiled for the first time since arriving. Now that sounds like a plan. But, Harry? Don't call her tonight. Give her a few more days to process everything that happened. When you do talk, make sure you're ready to have the hardest conversation of your marriage. After Marcus left, Harry wandered through his empty house, thinking about the conversation they would need to have. He would have to admit that part of him had been genuinely tempted by his father's offer, that the life they had built together wasn't completely fulfilling for him. But he would also have to make clear that his love for her and their children was stronger than his nostalgia for royal life. The question was whether Meghan would be able to accept a husband who was conflicted about the choices they had made together. Her note suggested that she was questioning whether the man she had married still existed, whether the Harry who had chosen love over duty was the same person who had spent a week considering a return to royal obligations. As Harry finally went to bed in their empty bedroom, he realized that the Highgrove Accord had accomplished something neither he nor his father had anticipated. It had forced him to confront the truth about his feelings toward royal life, and, in doing so, it had created the first real crisis of his marriage to Meghan. Whether that crisis would ultimately strengthen their relationship or destroy it remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: the comfortable illusion that he had completely moved on from his royal past was gone forever. The accord itself might be dead, but its ghost would haunt Harry's marriage for months to come, forcing both him and Meghan to decide whether their love was strong enough to survive the revelation that neither of them was quite who the other had thought they were. 5 days after Harry's return to Montecito, he finally worked up the courage to drive to Doria Raglan's house in Los Angeles. The modest craftsman-style home in a quiet neighborhood felt like neutral territory, a place where he and Meghan might be able to have the conversation that would either save their marriage or confirm that it was over. As he sat in his car outside the house, watching Archie play in the front yard while Doria supervised from the porch, Harry realized how much he had missed his children in just a few days apart. Archie spotted him first, dropping his toy truck and running toward the car with the unbridled enthusiasm that only a 3-year-old could muster. "Daddy," he shouted, launching himself into Harry's arms as soon as he stepped out of the vehicle. The simple joy of holding his son again almost brought Harry to tears, reminding him of exactly what was at stake in the conversation he was about to have with Meghan. Doria greeted him with a warm hug, but her eyes held a warning that he couldn't ignore. "She's been hurting, Harry," she said quietly while Archie ran back to his toys. "Whatever happened in London, it scared her in a way I haven't seen since the early days of your relationship. She needs to know that you're all in, not halfway committed to this life you've built together." Harry nodded, understanding that Doria was giving him guidance on how to approach the conversation with her daughter. "I am all in," he said. "But I also need to be honest about the things I've been struggling with. We can't build a marriage on me pretending to be someone I'm not." "Just remember that honesty without compassion can be cruel," Doria replied. "And Meghan's been through enough cruelty for one lifetime." Meghan was waiting in the living room, holding Lilibet and looking more fragile than Harry had seen her since their wedding day. The strain of the past week was evident in the dark circles under her eyes and the way she held herself, as if she were protecting herself from another blow. She looked up when he entered the room, and, for a moment they simply stared at each other, both trying to read what the other was thinking. "Hi," Harry said softly, sitting down in the chair across from where she was seated on the couch. "Hi," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "How was your flight?" The small talk felt absurd given the magnitude of what they needed to discuss, but Harry understood that they were both trying to find their footing in a conversation that could change everything. "Long," he said. "I had a lot of time to think." Meghan shifted Lilibet to her other arm, the baby gurgling contentedly and reaching for her mother's earrings. "And what conclusions did you reach?" Harry took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would set the tone for everything that followed. "I reached the conclusion that I've been lying to both of us," he said. "Not intentionally, but lying nonetheless about how completely I've moved on from royal life." Meghan's expression didn't change, but Harry could see her grip tighten slightly on Lilibet. "Go on," she said. "When my father made his proposal, I should have said no immediately," Harry continued. "The fact that I didn't, the fact that I seriously considered it, tells me that I haven't dealt with some of the grief I feel about leaving that life behind. Not the duties or the protocols or the media attention, but the sense of purpose and belonging that came with serving something larger than myself." "So you do want to go back," Meghan said, her voice flat and resigned. "No," Harry replied firmly. "I don't want to go back. But I need to acknowledge that part of me misses certain aspects of what I left behind, and I need to find a way to fill that void without destroying what we've built together." Meghan was quiet for a long time, absently stroking Lilibet's hair as she processed what Harry had said. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, as if she were trying to be very careful about each one. "I knew this day would come," she said. "I knew that eventually you would start to miss the life you gave up for me. I just hoped we would have more time to build something strong enough to withstand it." "You didn't give up that life for you," Harry said, leaning forward in his chair. "I gave it up for us, for our children, for the chance to build a life based on our values instead of theirs." "That hasn't changed. Hasn't it?" Meghan asked, meeting his eyes for the first time since he had arrived. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you spent a week in London remembering all the things you loved about being a prince, and now you're trying to find a way to have both lives without admitting that's what you're doing." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be devastating. Harry had been trying to find a middle ground that would allow him to reconnect with his family without fully returning to royal life, but Meghan was right that such an arrangement would be inherently unstable. There was no halfway position when it came to the monarchy, either he was in or he was out, and any attempt to straddle the line would create constant tension and uncertainty. "You're right," Harry admitted. "I have been trying to find a way to have both, and that's not fair to you or the kids. But I also can't pretend that part of me doesn't miss what I gave up. If we're going to move forward together, we need to find a way to deal with that reality." Meghan handed Lilibet to Harry and stood up, walking to the window and looking out at the street where Archie was still playing under his grandmother's watchful eye. "I can accept that you have complicated feelings about royal life," she said without turning around. "What I can't accept is you making unilateral decisions about our future based on those feelings. When you extended your stay in London, when you had multiple meetings with your father without telling me, when you seriously considered an arrangement that would fundamentally change our lives, you treated me like a problem to be managed rather than a partner to be consulted." Harry felt the truth of her words like a physical blow. In his focus on the emotional complexity of his father's proposal, he had lost sight of the fact that he was making decisions that would affect his entire family without including Meghan in the process. "You're absolutely right," he said. "I should have called you after the first meeting. I should have been honest about how the proposal was affecting me instead of trying to figure it out on my own." "Yes, you should have," Meghan agreed, finally, turning back to face him. "But, more than that, you should have trusted me enough to share your complicated feelings without worrying that I would judge you for them. Instead, you tried to protect me from your doubts, which made me feel like you didn't think I was strong enough to handle the truth." Harry looked down at Lilibet, who was now sleeping peacefully in his arms, completely unaware of the conversation that was determining her family's future. "I was trying to protect you," he said quietly. "But you're right that it came from a place of not trusting you to understand my perspective." "I don't need protection, Harry," Meghan said, returning to her seat on the couch. "I need honesty. I need to know that when you're struggling with something, you'll talk to me about it instead of disappearing to London for a week and coming back with a life-changing proposal I knew nothing about." The conversation continued for hours, with both of them taking turns expressing their fears, their disappointments, and their hopes for what their relationship could become. Harry admitted that he had been struggling with a sense of purposelessness in California, that the charitable work and speaking engagements felt less meaningful than the royal duties he had performed. Meghan acknowledged that she had been so focused on protecting their new life that she hadn't created space for Harry to express his doubts and conflicts. "I think we both made the mistake of assuming that leading royal life would solve all our problems," Meghan said as the afternoon wore on. "But the truth is that it just created new problems that we haven't been willing to acknowledge." Harry nodded, bouncing Lilibet gently as she began to stir. "So what do we do now? How do we move forward knowing that we're both more complicated than we've been pretending to be?" Meghan was quiet for a long time before responding. "I think we start by agreeing that this marriage has to be strong enough to survive the fact that we're both still figuring out who we are outside of royal life," she said. "And I think we need to find ways for you to feel purposeful and connected to something larger than yourself that don't require going backward to a life that hurt us both." "What would that look like?" Harry asked. "I don't know yet," Meghan admitted. "But I know it starts with us being completely honest with each other, even when that honesty is uncomfortable or inconvenient." As the sun began to set, they called Archie in from the yard and sat together on the couch, their children between them as they continued to work through the implications of everything that had been said. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions to the fundamental tension between Harry's complicated feelings about his heritage and Meghan's determination to protect their independence. But, for the first time since Harry had received his father's phone call 2 weeks earlier, there was hope that their marriage might survive this crisis. They had finally been honest with each other about their fears and their needs, and that honesty had created a foundation for rebuilding trust. "I want to come home," Harry said as they prepared to leave Doria's house. "But I need you to know that I'm still figuring out how to be happy with the life we've chosen. I'm committed to doing that work, but it's going to take time." Meghan squeezed his hand, the first physical affection she had shown him since his return from London. "I want you to come home too," she said. "And I want to help you figure out how to be fulfilled in this life we're building together." "But, Harry? No more unilateral decisions. No more protecting me from your complicated feelings. If we're going to make this work, we have to be partners in every sense of the word." As they drove back to Montecito with their children sleeping in the back seat, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced since before his father's phone call: peace. Not the peace of having all the answers, but the peace of knowing that he and Meghan were committed to finding those answers together. The Highgrove Accord was truly dead now, not just rejected but replaced by something more valuable, a new understanding between Harry and Meghan about what their marriage would need to survive the ongoing complications of their extraordinary life. But even as they drove toward home and reconciliation, neither of them could know that the crisis sparked by Charles's proposal was far from over. The royal family's reaction to Harry's rejection of the accord would test their renewed commitment to each other in ways they couldn't imagine, and the public revelation of the secret negotiations would create a scandal that would rock the monarchy to its foundations. For now, though, they had each other and the hope that love might be enough to overcome the legacy of trauma and conflict that had nearly torn them apart. The real test of their marriage was still to come, but they would face it together, with honesty as their weapon and truth as their shield. 3 weeks after Harry and Meghan's reconciliation, their carefully rebuilt peace was shattered by a phone call that would change everything. Harry was in his home office, working on preparations for a veterans' mental health initiative, when his private secretary James called from London with news that made his blood run cold. "Sir, I'm afraid there's been a significant development," James said, his usually calm voice edged with anxiety. "Details about the Highgrove Accord have been leaked to the press. The Sunday Times is running a front-page story tomorrow revealing the existence of your father's proposal and your consideration of it." Harry felt the world tilt around him as he processed what James was telling him. How is that possible? Only 3 people knew about the accord: my father, myself, and you. "I'm afraid it's more complicated than that, sir," James replied. "It appears that Prince William was briefed on the proposal and shared details with certain senior courtiers. The leak seems to have come from within the palace communications team, though we don't yet know the specific source." The betrayal hit Harry like a physical blow. Not only had his father shared the private details of their negotiations with William without his consent, but someone in the royal establishment had deliberately leaked the story to undermine him. After hanging up with James, Harry sat in stunned silence, trying to imagine how he would explain to Meghan that their private family crisis was about to become front-page news around the world. He found her in the kitchen, preparing lunch for the children while Archie played with blocks on the floor and Lilibet napped in her high chair. The domestic tranquility of the scene made what he had to tell her even more devastating. "Meg, we need to talk," he said, and something in his voice made her immediately stop what she was doing and give him her full attention. When he explained about the leak, Meghan's reaction was swift and fierce. "They did this on purpose," she said, her voice tight with controlled rage. "They waited until we worked things out between us, and then they leaked the story to punish you for rejecting their offer." Harry wanted to defend his family, to suggest that the leak might have been accidental or the work of a rogue staff member, but he couldn't find any credible alternative explanation. The timing was too convenient, the details too specific, for this to be anything other than a calculated attack designed to damage his relationship with Meghan and undermine his credibility with the public. "What does the story say exactly?" Meghan asked, already reaching for her phone to begin damage control planning. "James is getting me an advance copy, but apparently it portrays the accord as a generous peace offering that I rejected due to Meghan's influence," Harry said. "They're painting you as the villain who prevented a royal reconciliation." The irony was devastating. Just when Harry and Meghan had finally found their way back to each other, the royal family had weaponized their private healing process against them. The leaked story would not only invade their privacy but also reinforce the narrative that Meghan was the divisive force keeping Harry from his family, rather than a woman who had been protecting her marriage from institutional manipulation. Within hours of the story breaking, their phones were ringing constantly with calls from journalists, friends, and colleagues wanting to know their side of the story. The peaceful life they had worked so hard to build in California was once again under siege, and this time the attack was coming from the very family members Harry had been trying to reconcile with. Meghan's response was characteristically direct and strategic. "We're going to tell our truth," she announced after spending an hour on the phone with their communications team. "Not reactive, not defensive, but proactive and complete. People deserve to know what really happened during those meetings in London." Harry felt a familiar twist of anxiety in his stomach at the prospect of another public battle with his family. "Are you sure that's the right approach? Maybe we should just let this blow over." "There is no letting this blow over, Harry," Meghan replied, her voice firm with conviction. "They've made our private family business into a public spectacle, and they've done it in a way that makes me look like the controlling wife who manipulated you into rejecting your father's generous offer. I won't let that narrative stand unchallenged." Over the next 48 hours, Harry and Meghan crafted a comprehensive response that would be released through their foundation's website and social media channels. The statement detailed the full scope of Charles's proposal, including the conditions that would have required them to spend significant portions of each year in the UK and the restrictions that would have been placed on their commercial activities. More importantly, it revealed the emotional pressure Harry had felt during the negotiations and his ultimate decision to prioritize his marriage and children's well-being over royal duties. The characterization of the Highgrove Accord as a generous peace offering fundamentally misunderstands what was actually proposed, the statement read in part. "While we appreciate the King's desire to heal family relationships, the accord was structured in a way that would have required us to abandon the independent life we have built in California and return to a system of royal service that had proven harmful to our mental health and family stability." The response also addressed the leak itself, expressing disappointment that private family negotiations had been made public and suggesting that the timing of the revelation was designed to punish Harry for declining to resume royal duties. "It is deeply concerning that confidential family discussions have been weaponized against us in the press," the statement concluded. "This breach of trust makes future reconciliation efforts significantly more difficult and calls into question the royal family's commitment to healing rather than winning public relations battles." The royal family's reaction to Harry and Meghan's statement was swift and uncharacteristically aggressive. Within hours, Buckingham Palace issued its own response, expressing sadness at Harry and Meghan's continued attacks on the institution and suggesting that their version of events was incomplete and misleading. The statement hinted at additional details about the negotiations that cast Harry in a less favorable light, though it stopped short of revealing what those details might be. More damaging was a carefully orchestrated series of leaks to friendly journalists that painted Harry as unstable and conflicted during the London meetings. According to these reports, Harry had been emotionally volatile and clearly struggling with his decision to leave royal life. The stories suggested that the accord had been Charles's attempt to provide his troubled son with structure and purpose, only to be thwarted by Meghan's unwillingness to compromise. The media war escalated quickly, with each side releasing more details about the private negotiations in an attempt to control the narrative. British tabloids published what they claimed were excerpts from Harry's conversations with his father, depicting him as torn between duty and loyalty to his wife. American media outlets, meanwhile, focused on the emotional manipulation Harry had endured and the impossible position the accord had placed him in. For Harry, watching his family's private pain play out in headlines around the world was devastating in a way that surpassed even their previous public conflicts. This wasn't about competing interpretations of royal duty or different visions for the monarchy's future. This was about the deliberate destruction of any possibility for genuine reconciliation, carried out by people who claimed to love him but seemed more interested in winning than healing. "I feel like I'm watching my family die," he told Meghan one evening as they read through the latest round of media coverage. "Every news story, every leaked detail, every official response drives us further apart. At some point, there won't be anything left to salvage." Meghan took his hand, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, Harry. I know how much you wanted to find a way back to them. But maybe this is actually a gift, seeing them clearly for who they really are." The crisis reached its peak when William broke his years-long silence about Harry with an interview on the BBC. Sitting in the same chair where their mother had given her famous Panorama interview decades earlier, William spoke about his grief over losing his brother and his frustration with Harry's continued need to air private family matters in public. "I love Harry deeply," William said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I can't continue to watch him burn down our family's reputation to build his own brand in America." The accord was an attempt to offer him a path home, and his rejection of it, along with the public attacks that followed, have convinced me that he's chosen his new life over his heritage in a way that makes reconciliation impossible. The interview devastated Harry in a way that surprised him with its intensity. Despite everything that had happened between them, he had held on to hope that William still saw him as a brother worth fighting for. Hearing William essentially write him off as a lost cause on national television felt like the final severing of a bond that had sustained Harry through the darkest moments of his life. But if William's interview was intended to isolate Harry and Meghan, it had the opposite effect. Public reaction was swift and largely negative, with many viewers criticizing William for his coldness toward his brother and his failure to acknowledge the royal family's role in driving Harry away. Social media exploded with support for Harry and Meghan, and several high-profile celebrities and politicians defended their decision to prioritize their family's well-being over royal obligations. More significantly, the crisis prompted serious questions about the monarchy's future in an age when institutional secrecy and manipulation were increasingly transparent to public scrutiny. Editorial writers on both sides of the Atlantic questioned whether a system that could create such dysfunction within its own family was capable of serving the public interest in the 21st century. As the immediate media storm began to subside after 2 weeks of constant coverage, Harry and Meghan found themselves in a strange position. They had won the public relations battle, with polls showing majority support for their handling of the situation. But the victory felt hollow because it had come at the cost of any realistic hope for family reconciliation. "I think this is actually the end," Harry told Meghan as they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean. "Not just of my relationship with my father and brother, but of any possibility that our children will have meaningful connections to their British heritage." Meghan was quiet for a long time before responding. "Maybe that's not entirely a bad thing," she said finally. "Maybe our children are better off building their own heritage, creating their own traditions, instead of inheriting the dysfunction we've been trying to heal." As autumn turned to winter in California, Harry and Meghan settled into a new phase of their life together, one defined by the acceptance that they were truly on their own. The Highgrove Accord, which had begun as a potential bridge between Harry's past and future, had become the final battle in a war that had been raging since the day he fell in love with an American actress who refused to be diminished by ancient protocols. But, in losing his birth family, Harry had gained something equally valuable: absolute clarity about his priorities and complete certainty that he had chosen the right path. The man who had once been torn between duty and love was now wholly committed to the family he had chosen, and the relief of that clarity was worth more than any royal title or ceremonial role. The Highgrove Accord was dead, the royal family was effectively lost to them, and their private pain had become public spectacle. But Harry and Meghan were still standing, still fighting, still building something beautiful in the space between what they had lost and what they had found. In the end, that would have to be enough, because it was all they had, and it was theirs.